ladies and gentlemen. My name's Jean Moy. I'm the curator and host of the QPAC and ABT Conversation series. Before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather here today, and I'd like to pay respect to their elders past, present and future. I would also like to introduce our wonderful conversationalist today for our third and final event, which is Ormsby Wilkins, who's the music director of ABT, and Richard Wenn, who is the Director of Artistic Planning at the Queensland Symphony Orchestra. Could you please put your hands together to welcome them here today? We also have another special guest, but I'll leave that to Ormsby to reveal a little bit later in the conversation. The conversation series, as I mentioned, this is our final one. We're an opportunity to provide audience members with the ability to directly connect with the company, to understand a little bit more about not only the repertoire, but today about the fabulous music that partners the dancing. And you'll hear today about Swan Lake as well as the pieces from the three masterpieces, which is an event that actually opens up on Friday night. So if you haven't got tickets yet, I please invite you to get in and be quick. The seasons are selling fast. Just to get a bit of an idea, who has actually seen Swan Lake in the audience? Can you just pop your hands up so we can, Ormsby, can you get a bit of an idea of that? Fantastic, that's wonderful. Well, without further ado, I will hand over to Richard, who's going to have a lovely conversation with Ormsby about the brilliance of music and dance. Thank you very much.
So, welcome back to Brisbane, Ormsby. We've enjoyed working with you with the orchestra, and you've been with Swan Lake for so many years, I'm sure. Have you ever counted how many performances you've...
I haven't counted, but it's probably well over 100 performances of Swan Lake. I think it was one of the early ballets that I conducted at the Australian Ballet. There was a production. I don't know whether any of you remember that the old production of the Australian Ballet was by Anne Williams, who was the artistic director. And I'm going to just say something about that in relation to also to the original production, because of course Swan Lake was Tchaikovsky's first ballet. We know that there are three masterpieces: Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker. They're all extraordinary pieces. The Swan Lake was the first one, and what we don't know about the original production is how much of a libretto there was a libretto, but how much Tchaikovsky was directed in terms of matching his score with the ballet master's vision of choreographer's vision of the ballet, because Tchaikovsky was totally new to ballet. He had written there's all sorts of music, even in his early symphonies, dance suite, ballets and waltzes and polonaises. He'd written a lot of dance-related music, but he'd never actually written a ballet before. And of course, in the Imperial Ballet in Russia, most of the composers were all specialist ballet composers, and in fact, the ballet master was supreme, and the composer had to write music that was totally in sync with the choreography and the scenario. So it tended to attract, shall we say, not necessarily the best composers, because there was so much restriction on what they were allowed to produce. And of course these are composers like Minkus and Drigo and Pugny, who produced very serviceable music for the ballet, and we perform a number of their ballets like La Bayadère and Don Quixote. They're both Minkus. Le Corsaire is another one. There's a whole load of them that we don't actually see, but the Russians do a lot of. But in any case, Tchaikovsky was new to this, so when we look at the score, we see that there's a pas de trois. He's obviously asked to do a pas de trois in the first act and a pas de deux, and all those forms that were typical of Russian ballet. But on the other hand, you feel that also Tchaikovsky went his own way as well in terms of what he was writing. He had a vision.
Yes, he would have been the first significant Russian composer writing
for ballet.
Yes, because all the others would have been imported.
Yes,
the ballet masters.
Absolutely. The interesting thing is, I think that the French were a little bit more ahead of the Russians in terms of music. So, for instance, the first great story ballet really was Giselle, written by Adam, who wasn't a great composer, but a very good composer, and wrote really a lovely score, and wrote and included a lot of leitmotif, and it was very through composed, rather than just a series of dance numbers. It has a lot of storytelling in it, and all the characters. A lot of the characters have themes that recur throughout the ballet, and then the next, perhaps a step up in French ballet was Delibes. And you know, Tchaikovsky, he had written Swan Lake, and he heard Sylvia, and he said, if I had heard Sylvia before I wrote Swan Lake would have been better. We have no real complaints about Swan Lake, but I thought that was interesting. He was a great admirer of Delibes, and Delibes is a very, very good composer. And both the two ballets that are performed of Delibes, Coppelia and Sylvia, are both wonderful, wonderful scores, and they have a flow to them, and they have the themes and the music express the dramatic story of. So anyway, we have Swan Lake, and Swan Lake, as I say, it was a labour of love for Tchaikovsky. And the thing was that the experience was not a great experience for him, because the production in the end was not considered to be a particularly good one. Although it did have a lot of people. It has been said that it was a failure. Well, it's not really a failure, and it got a number of performances over several years, but it apparently wasn't, a match for the music.
Ask you the difference when Swan Lake comes along. The ballets like the Delibes ballets, they're quite contained in scale. So we've got the Tchaikovsky form, which is from a Mozart scale, but the dramatic end in Swan Lake, that's probably never been heard before.
Absolutely,
in a ballet.
never anything like it. And he didn't. There are certain what he did. He wrote it in a very symphonic way. I can demonstrate that a little bit with. He didn't use a lot of leitmotifs, like, little themes for every character. But of course, the most famous theme. We know that. But what's interesting is that comes in all sorts of forms. Now, the very beginning of the ballet is this. So the first 5 notes, here is the start of the famous theme, but he actually sort of reversed it. And that sort of writing is a very symphonic way of writing, of taking a cell and expanding it or reducing it or changing it slightly, but it all has a relationship. And of course, the other thing that Tchaikovsky was very interested in was keys. So this key is, I don't want to get too technical, but we all know about keys in music, I think. And B minor is a very dominant key in the whole ballet. And I think there's a man called Roland John Wiley who wrote a very interesting book about the Tchaikovsky ballets, and he talked about the key relationships in Swan Lake, and how the entrance of this perhaps that one, or this perhaps represents the lake or the swans, but then the entrance, but in fact in the scene in the first act when we first see Siegfried, it's all in a sort of major key. That's sort of his key in the beginning. But then as we go on and move into the third act, he goes into more into keys in flats, and it takes on a darker hue as the ballet goes on. But it's interesting. So we have that tune. Then there's a dance for princesses, because Siegfried's mother wants him to marry one of these princesses, and of course he's already seen Odette in the second act and is in love with her, so he doesn't really want to have anything to do with the princesses, but this is their music. So there we have another, but it's in a totally different key and it sounds completely different. But these are not things that you would necessarily be aware of, and you shouldn't necessarily be aware of them. But it's what gives these scores such a unique quality, or this score particularly a unique quality, is this sort of synthesis that he does, and the symphonic synthesis, which I think is just sort of fantastic. And I think just to perhaps finish off, the greatest synthesis, the greatest moment, of course, is at the very end of the ballet, when, of course, Siegfried has betrayed Odette in the third act by swearing his love for someone he thought was Odette, but it turned out not to be Odette. But of course, he comes back into the lakeside, and basically the only way to destroy Rothbard is for them to commit suicide. I always think that, apparently it was sort of okay to commit suicide in the theatre. We don't think of it as something particularly noble, but in this case it is, because it breaks the spell. So she throws herself into the lake, and then he throws himself into the lake, and that, of course, releases everyone from the spell of this terrible sorcerer. But the wonderful thing is, of course, the theme comes back full on. So, and we hear that, and he sort of develops this. In the major key. Da da dee da da. So this is the final moment when it says, yes, we've succeeded in killing Rothbard, and this is the great climax of the whole ballet. Is this moment when it turns into the major. Then the final, there's even something better to come, if you can believe that there's something better to come.